Well, hi everybody. Welcome to Stratosphere Lounge. It's your host Bill Whittle, and the show number is unknown to me. I will figure it out after we save it. I want to say it's 132, but I'm not 100% sure. And sorry about the late start here today. But the good news is I've been working like a little demon, like crazy man, on this latest firewall, which I'm going to call Debating Hillary. So let me just tell you a little bit about that, kind of get me warmed up, and then we'll take the questions. Although I haven't even looked at them yet, I haven't set them aside, so we'll read them right out of the comments stream. But in general, I was watching the debates, as I know many of you were, and needless to say, a lot of people going, "Hello there, are we all right?" Hey, good, okay. Needless to say, I thought Donald Trump in the first 20 minutes was just pounding it out at the park, just nailing this woman on all of her lies and everything else. And then obviously he just kind of dropped the ball. I think he dropped the ball once he went on the defensive. I think Hillary Clinton understands that that the way to get Donald Trump off a message is to go after his ego. When she started questioning his money, when she started questioning whether or not he was as rich as he said he was, he spent the whole rest of the debate backpedaling the whole time. Every time she'd accuse him of something that bothered his ego, he would go back to, well, I did this, and I've got this very nice resort where there's no racism here, and everybody says I'm very low. All right, let me see if I can boost it up a little bit. It's always nice to get feedback. I've been using the other mic, the blue mic, which has been great, but getting it to work here is tough. Let's see if I can give it a little more push here without it ultimately. Okay, hopefully that's a little better. Anyway, hopefully that'll do it on the volume thing. Look, today's show has been incredibly rushed, and as I said, it's rushed because I was writing this latest firewall, and as I was saying a moment ago, I think Donald Trump handled himself overall relatively well, but once he got on the defensive, it was a mess, and worse than that, he replied to Hillary Clinton in a lot of different ways, and there have already been a fairly large number of people who have put out articles or videos explaining all of the lies that Hillary Clinton told during that time. I'm going to just get this headroom right if it kills me. But I didn't want to do that because, number one, other people do fact-checking better than I do, and there's a lot of things that I like to do that I like to think that other people don't do quite as well. So, basically, what I've done is I've written the next firewall called Debating Hillary, and basically I went and looked through the transcripts, and I found I don't know, six or seven cases where it's not just a question of her being factually wrong. It's a question of her starting from one of these progressive precepts that make no sense whatsoever and went completely unchallenged. So I'm calling this Debating Hillary because I'm not going to make the points that Donald Trump made. I'm not going to make Donald Trump's points. What I am going to do is I am going to respond to her arguments with a coherent and consistent conservative message. And it's something I've done live a lot of times, and I've gotten all these things kind of worked out just through having to defend them for a number of years, and they all make sense. But this is the thing about this firewall. Ideally, smaller firewall, shorter firewalls do much better because it's just the attention span thing. And I thought, okay, I'm going to take maybe three or four of her total arguments about, the wealthy not paying their fair share, or the green energy that we're going to use, and we shouldn't respond to taunts start a war over taunts from Iranian sailors, the whole thing. And I kept looking at them, and I kept saying, well, I have to take at least three or four, and I couldn't take three or four. I kept saying there must be one or two of these, at least two or three of these that are so important, that are not as important as the others, and just don't deal with those. Don't deal with energy, let's say, or don't deal with the global climate change thing. Just leave that go. And I just couldn't do it. I just couldn't. They're all just sitting there as these fat targets, and I just couldn't leave them alone. So I didn't. I'm afraid this one is going to be 10, 12 minutes, maybe 15 minutes. That is a long time for a firewall, but it's been a while since I've done one on the same kind of level as the atomic bomb firewall. I'm not trying to pretend that this is going to be as good as that, but there's so much substance to attack that if I just do 3 or 4 of them, then it makes it look like all the rest of her stuff stands and makes sense. I just want to destroy all of them. So just since we start with a little fun here, and we're only doing an hour tonight, so I can get back on this. Let me see the points here. So she mentioned raising national minimum wage, equal pay for women's work, profit sharing for companies, having the wealthy pay their fair share. That's one whole beat. That's a lot of stuff for me to rebut, but it's not so hard. Then I'm going to go to the Great Recession we were in 8 years ago, how the Democrats inherited this mess from George Bush, and thank God for Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and their policies, because if it hadn't been for them, think of the trouble we'd be in. And I go and talk about the Community Reinvestment Act, and I talk about how it's the Democratic policies of making banks write mortgages that they knew were not good that caused this problem. And so the Democrats caused the problem, and then they take credit for solving the problem, which pretty much seems to be the MO of the Democratic Party in a nutshell. Let's see. Then she talks about clean energy. More of this. We're going to trot out 500 million more solar panels and all the rest of it. So I go into Solyndra, and then I go into the fact that they won't let us get our own energy and how low energy costs allow us to compete against low labor costs and all the rest. And I have to tell you, I did just a little bit of additional research, more than I have done before, on the climate change argument. I'm kind of giving you guys kind of a quick, advanced look at the whole thing, but that's why we do the Stratosphere launch sometimes. And basically, my argument about climate change is pretty simple. I said, let's not talk about what the model predicts or what the atmosphere is showing. Let's just talk about what is undeniable historical fact. And the undeniable historical fact is that if you look at the part of America that's now occupied by Kansas, if you go back 80 million years to the end of the Cretaceous era, you find out that what is now Kansas was under not 2 inches of water or 2 feet of water or 200 feet of water. Kansas was under 2,000 feet of water on the North Inland Ocean. I think it's called North Inland Seaway. It was under 2,000 feet of water, because the polar ice caps had completely melted. And in the middle of America, right where Kansas is, there were dinosaurs and ferns and plesiosaurs and pterodactyls through the air, and there was this incredibly rich biome, all of these animals. And carbon dioxide levels at the end of the Cretaceous were not 10% or 20% or 50% higher than they are now. They were 1,000 or 10,000? 1,000% higher. They were 10 times as high. Could somebody confirm that for me, by the way? I'm an idiot about this math. 10 times something is 1,000% of it, right? In any event, they're trying to keep current CO2 levels to around 400, 450 parts per million. They're panicking over 400 parts per million. And during the late Cretaceous, it was 4,000 parts per million. It was 10 times as much carbon dioxide in the air as there is now. Here's where it gets interesting, though. Because if you take that same exact place in Kansas that was under 2,000 feet of water 80 million years ago, you find out that 80,000 years ago, that exact same piece of dirt was under 5,000 feet. More than that, 10,000 feet, 2 miles, 10,000 feet of ice. 10,000 feet of ice covered that exact same spot that 80 million years ago was covered in 2,000 feet of water. If you think about what 10,000 feet of ice looks like, imagine a jet. We've seen them 1,000 times, a jet at cruising altitude off in the distance, and you can see how high that jet is. Well, imagine ice that goes 1/3 of the way up to where that jet is, because that jet's cruising at about 30,000 feet. 10,000 feet of ice on that same spot in Kansas that 80 million years ago was underwater and was filled with dinosaurs and was warm, hot even. So, what does that tell us? First of all, whose SUVs caused the flooding? Whose coal power plants caused the center of the country to be under 2,000 feet of water 80 million years ago? And secondly, if this runaway climate heat, if the runaway heat is so bad, then why is it that 80 million years ago we had 4,000 parts per million, and we had temperatures much higher on the Earth, temperatures hot enough to melt the polar caps? So if we're under 2,000 feet of water 80 million years ago, And we're still sweating. All these global warming predictions are for no more than, 2-3 inch rise in sea level. We were under 2,000 feet of water in Kansas. In Kansas. Why is this important? It's important because not only were we under 2,000 feet of water 80 million years ago, but 80,000 years ago we were under 10,000 feet of ice, and we didn't have anything to do with any of these things. So when the Democrats and the progressives come out and say we're against climate change, the climate is changing all the time. And the really salient point here is this. If we had 10 times the carbon dioxide levels, not 10% more, but 10 times more carbon dioxide, temperatures were so high that the ice caps had completely melted. And then about 100 million years later, the conditions on the Earth are such that we now have 10,000 feet of ice in the exact same spot. What does that really mean in the end? Where's the danger? And what it really means in the end is that the Earth has positive feedback mechanisms. Because if it didn't, if the Earth did not have the ability to correct itself back towards the mean, which is pretty simple really, but if it didn't have those things, then the Earth would have cooked to a cinder or would have been a snowball, a frozen ice ball in space a billion years ago. When things get warmer, there are more clouds. Clouds reflect light back into space and it cools the planet. When the Earth gets cooler, there are fewer clouds. The seas and the oceans are darker. They absorb more heat and it raises the temperature. And there's a bunch of other little things that are worked there too. But this climate change thing is just simply there to make sure that people don't have access to free energy or cheap energy, because if we did, then American jobs would come rushing back. And if American jobs came rushing back, then people would be making more money. And if people were making more money, they'd be voting Republican. And that's basically the reason why this doesn't exist. So there you go. Of all the drop balls during the night with Donald Trump, I honestly, I was, when the question was being asked and when she was answering, I was actually salivating. I was leaning forward saying, here comes the death blow. When Hillary Clinton was asked about cyber warfare, about computer attacks on the country, and she says there's a bunch of cyber attacks against all kinds of organizations in our country, and I'm deeply concerned about this. Well, Hillary, you're not so concerned that you didn't have a private server with the most secret and sensitive information on the entire United States government on a regular computer in your basement that hadn't even done the basic Microsoft security updates, and you weren't so secured about the safety of this country when you lost 13 BlackBerries with sensitive information on it. What you're really interested in is having a personal server that's immune from Freedom of Information Act requests so that nobody can find out how you got $1 billion into that foundation and a $100 million income by selling access and selling American trade restrictions or advantages for money. There's a word for somebody who sells out their country security for money, and that word is traitor, and that's what she is. God, ISIS. I'm going to go into some detail about ISIS, how they created ISIS. Created them. They created them from what was left of AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. The Democrats couldn't let there be a win in Iraq, even though during the last 5 months there were no American fatalities in Iraq. War was won. You may not have liked the war. You may not have liked why we went in there. That's fine, but the war was won. And so that can't be. They took credit for the war being won, the Democrats, and then they pulled all of our troops out of there. Didn't pull all of our troops out of Europe 70 years ago or 60 years ago. We didn't pull all the troops out of Korea 50 years ago. However, we pulled all of the troops out of Iraq, and in that vacuum formed Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and it took on a deadly form called ISIS. It's continued to grow, and they could have stopped it at any time, but they didn't want the humiliation of putting boots on the ground back in Iraq when they'd already promised and praised themselves for getting us boots out of Iraq. So it just grew and grew and grew until people were being slaughtered in Brussels and Paris and in San Bernardino, Orlando, all the rest. It just continued to grow because they were bent on losing in Iraq. And furthermore, they launched unauthorized wars in Libya. We saw he died. The rest of the country died with him. Same thing with Syria. So if George Bush's the death of Iraqi civilians and American soldiers on his hands for the Iraq War, then Hillary Clinton has the 400,000 or 500,000 Syrians and Libyans and all the rest of them who are killing each other, continue to kill each other every day on her hands because she created ISIS. She created it. That started it. And then finally, I think the thing is, I think the thing I'm going to end with is this thing where she said Donald Trump was, saying that if Iranian soldiers had taunted American ships or sailors, then he would sink them. And she said that would lead to war. What a silly idea. The man's unfit to be president. Turns out that is not, in fact, the case. As a matter of fact, if you don't respond to provocations like that, that's the guarantee for war. And I make the case about Hitler going into the Rhineland and all the rest. So anyway, it's going to be a real long one, and I guess it's going to really reduce its viewership. But I really did want to do something that felt like a debate response and showed people how all of these fundamental assumptions that she was working from are just wrong. They're wrong. Whether she knows their lies or not, they're wrong. There is no women pay gap. There is no, the rich pay more than their fair share. You do have to respond to provocations. Energy is the way to get our jobs back, but we can't get them because the Democrats won't let us get them. Democrats caused the housing crisis and then took credit for solving it, and on and on and on. So I'm just going to do one that's probably going to be, 12, 13 minutes, and I guess I'll see what numbers we get out of it. But I think somebody, somewhere, needs to show how, not only how wrong she is, but just how much of these assumptions are built into her statements and nobody challenges them. And so she's dead wrong. So anyway, that's what I've been working about. And I'm looking forward to getting back to it enormously, which is why we're doing a 1 hour show on the minute. And we are 16 minutes and 48 seconds into this mark. This is what your Star Trek nerds use when they're doing important political commentary. Anyway, that's that. So let's take a look at the questions. And again, I didn't get a chance to, usually I get a chance to at least cut and paste them, but I didn't have that chance today on account of me being so busy trying to save the world. Not really the world, mostly just America. And by the way, I had a debate recap, and I scheduled it to be released at this morning at 4:58, and it turns out I set it for PM instead of AM. Does that mean it just released earlier? Let's have a look. I bet it does mean that. Damn it. Maybe not. Maybe I just got the day wrong. Let me just correct that real quick. Because it's kind of important. Today's the 28th, and it says at 4:58 p.m., which is already later than it should be. So what's going on here? I know you guys just love these moments where we just completely pull away from the show. Okay, apparently I can't reschedule 4:58. Well, okay, whatever. Anyway, so I should have put that out yesterday, and this morning I made a mistake. Anyway, back to the questions for the Stratosphere Lounge. I do want to do better about doing these shows. I tend to miss them. Hey, my God, look at that. A Tiemans is back. Okay, I'm just going to take them kind of as they come off of the Facebook page. And if you didn't know this already, if you're watching on YouTube or whatever, you want to be part of the fun, you can just BillWhittle.com. We put the link up live, and you can ask questions in the Facebook comments, and I'll take the ones that I can at the beginning of the show. So let's get started. I usually do them by ranking, and this is a pretty good plan usually. So let's start with Zachariah Tiemans, who again is just back and 17 upvotes. The next closest one is 10, I think. So let's see what he says here. How is it possible for straight, white, and or male people to effectively defend and fight back against identity politics without digging in and embracing their own identity? It's actually a very good question. I thought you were going to tell me how could you do that without being called a racist? And the answer to that particular question is you can't. You cannot defend white Christian values or history without being called a racist, so just get used to it. Formerly being called a racist made everybody shut up. Once you realize that they call you a racist no matter what you say or do, then it loses its power. Let me look at that question here. Well, look, Zach, it's the difference between the rational and the irrational. It's the difference between the sane and the insane. You can defend it's kind of silly to say white achievements, but let's call it what it is in the context of your question, and male achievements and straight achievements. I mean, you can defend them by telling the truth. Virtually everything that's happened in the history of this country was done by straight white males. That doesn't mean that they're the only players in it, and it doesn't mean they're solely responsible for it. But when you think about things like the design of the Empire State Building, let's say, or the construction of the Hoover Dam, or virtually anything really was a result of straight white males. Now, here's where you have to draw the line. First of all, you have to understand that while many of these things have names attached to them, and those names are attached to primarily straight white males, doesn't mean that other people didn't have a part in it. It wasn't just straight white males that built Hoover Dam or Brooklyn Bridge or anything like that, or the railroads, for example, constructed largely out of Chinese labor and so on. So number one, by just citing the historical record, you're not excluding anybody. You also have to recognize that for a great deal of our history, blacks were excluded from participating, and so were women, and that's an absolutely true statement. There's nothing. You're kind of insane if you deny that. But to say that blacks and women are being excluded today is absurd. If anybody's being excluded today, it's because of it's straight white males, and the reason they're being excluded is because of the identity politics of the progressives. And they say that the people are that somebody. I saw some student somewhere saying that basically I owed her reparations. I owed her for something that happened to her great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. She wasn't a slave, and her parents weren't slaves, and their 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 parents weren't slaves. And what's especially interesting about that is that my parents weren't slaveholders, and I'm not a slaveholder, and my grandparents weren't slaveholders, and my great-grandparents, and none of them were. As a matter of fact, we didn't even get on the scene until 1915 for the Whittle clan here, and slavery was well over by then, but it doesn't matter, because even if you're directly descended from a slave-holding family, even if it was your father, it's not you, and the sins of the son are different. You are not responsible for people's behavior before you arrived on the scene. Now, one of the things that they like to say is that we still suffer, that white people still continue to get the benefits of our privilege. That even though slavery ended 150 years ago, we continue to still reap the benefits of slavery. That's patently false. You have to know a little history here. Sometimes you'll go so far as to say that you'll hear people say that black people built America essentially while white people just sat on the porch, sipping on a mint julep, and that ain't exactly it. Because you can make the case, I think, fairly compellingly, that you could never have had the Southern antebellum pre-Civil War Southern plantation system was in fact based on black labor, black slave labor. There's no question about that. And there's no question that those gigantic, beautiful Southern mansions were the result of black slave labor. That's absolutely true. But what's also absolutely true is that virtually all of that burned down during the Civil War, and that after the Civil War, there was no slave plantation culture anymore because it just simply couldn't exist legally because of Republicans, by the way. So everything that's built, everything you see now is essentially post-Civil War. I know that sounds like an odd thing to say, but it's really true. The entire Southern economy now, where there used to be slaves in the South, is now and has been completely post-slavery, post-Civil War. There's virtually nothing of the South that was built by slavery that still exists. It's absolutely true that black people contributed to a great deal of construction and we contributed everything, needless to say, music and all of it. It's a ridiculous thing to have to even say it. But the idea that we're still coasting on work that was done by field hands, in 1863 is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it's all part of a couple things, Zach. What they're really trying to do here, you got to really, I guess maybe to answer your question about how do you do this without getting into white identity politics and all that poison, is to simply say this. First of all, you've got to use this as a defense, not an attack. Because it's not accurate to say that that America was built exclusively by white people. It's ridiculous. It's obviously false. It's completely false. Blacks have contributed enormously. Hispanics have contributed enormously. Asians enormously. And by the way, when we first started having these arguments, we were talking about when these kind of arguments first came up, that we're seeing now with the alt-right, we were talking about people who'd been in America for 20, 30, 50 years, mostly of English descent, claiming that the Irish were unfit racially to be here, and that the Germans were, and the Italians were, and all the rest. So I hear it. I hear this kind of thing all the time. I think, Zechariah, I think my best advice to you would be the advice I try to keep for myself all the time, and that's this. Stay on the truth. Just stay where the truth is. Stay where the provable truth is, and truth is your defense. So, if you hear something that's not true, this reparations argument I just gave, for example, then fight it with the truth. However, if you hear people speculating on things that either haven't happened or never did happen, you got to call those too. You just can't go. I am utterly convinced. See, this is the hair that we have to kind of split here, because I'm convinced of this. We have to stop. This actually helps quite a bit. I just kind of had an insight on this. We've got to stop thinking of America as composed of blacks and whites and Hispanics and Asians and Germans and French, and well, not many French, unfortunately, and all the rest. We have to stop thinking of us that way, because this is not some kumbaya kind of a reason. There's a practical good reason for not thinking about the United States as a collection of different races, because there's a much better way to think about the United States, and that is this. The United States has been historically comprised of people who from all over the world have risked their lives, their property, their families, and everything to come here and take the risk to come to America. That's the one thing we actually have in common. And I've said this before, and I think it's absolutely true. If you took my grandfather, who came here in 1915, and stood him next to a person from China who came here in 1915, and a person from Kenya who came here in 1915, and a person from Spain who came here from 1915, my English grandfather would have more in common with those new Americans than he did with the people he left, because if he hadn't, he wouldn't have left. Everybody that came here to be new people, and that's why America works. The melting pot works. We are, in fact, strengthened by the diversity of our backgrounds and the diversity of our experiences and the diversity of our cultures. We're strengthened by the diversity of them coming into the system, but we are grossly weakened by trying to maintain that diversity coming out of the melting pot. In other words, the melting pot is a proven system that works, and not only works, it's a proven system to be the best engine for creation of wealth and comfort and prosperity and security in the history of the world. So I guess to close this argument, I think the ground you have to stand on is this. The American success story is composed of people who took extraordinary risks to come to America and to start a new life. That's the thing we have in common. And those people are of all different colors from all different places. You can have historical debates about who created what, who invented what, and all the rest of it, but that's not the same as saying that this is a complete, everything in America is built by blacks or by whites. It's built by Americans. It's been built by Americans, and the melting pot is the problem. The retreat from the melting pot rather is the problem. When people came to America, they became new people. That's what the whole melting pot is. We've got some Italian in there, throw it in. We've got some Greek in there, chuck it in, melt it all down, and now we've got something that's an alloy that's stronger than any one of the individual elements. But they're all Americans. It's not like Greek Americans or African Americans. It's just nonsense. So just stick to the truth, Zechariah, and realize that when you talk about people who make arguments completely on the basis of race, even though there may in fact be a fair amount of evidence for racial differences, that is not how we work here, and it's not what the country was based upon. The country is based upon individualism, and individuals of every race and religion and nationality have come here for the same reason, because they had the guts and the courage and, at least historically, the sense of hard work to start a new life and become new people. The melting pot takes in Greeks and Italians and Germans and Lithuanians and Chinese and all the rest. And it doesn't produce Lithuanian Americans or Chinese Americans. It produces new people. It produces people who are new. They're new people. And people, theoretically anyway, if they had this gigantic blood feud between, let's say, the Muslims and the Hindus, if you have a Pakistani store and you have an Indian restaurant right next to each other in America, you have to leave that crap behind. Sorry, you don't get to bring that here. That's not what comes with you. You can bring Indian food. You can bring Pakistani food. Lovely, wonderful, fantastic. And you can speak... you can speak Hindi or whatever the language is of those strange foreign people. You can speak German, Italian, whatever, at home. That's fine. You can speak it in public if you want to. That's fine too. But you can't expect the rest of the country to accommodate your incoming language. The language of this country is English, and that's why it works. That's part of the melting pot. Blah, 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 blah. Anyway, that's pretty much all I got to say about that. Number 2, oh my God, it's an Isaac Tiemans at number 10, and he says, if you could have one astronomical object appear as large in the sky as the full moon and visible to the naked eye, what would it be? Well, first of all, since this is an astronomy question rather than a personal taste question, I hate to break people's expectations of this. But if you were to put something spectacular like the Orion Nebula, let's say, we've all seen the pictures of the Orion Nebula, or at least you've seen pictures of these gigantic, enormous clouds of gas, and they're reds and purples and greens, and they're light years across. These giant, beautiful nebulae. Well, if we put the Andromeda, if we put the Orion Nebula, let's say, I may have said Andromeda earlier, I meant to say Orion. If you put the Orion Nebula right up against a point where it would be as large in the sky as the moon, you would not see this beautiful red detailed structure. You would see a gray smudge. I'm sorry to break it to you, but that's the way it is. The Milky Way, if you take a time exposure of the Milky Way, resolves itself into all these beautiful little pieces of, little areas of dust and stars, individual stars, globular clusters, planetary nebulae, and all the rest of the nebulae and so on. But it's too faint to see in that detail. You have to do a time exposure for that. So that's why every time you see like a Star Trek show or something like that, and you see people flying through these nebulae, and it looks exactly like they do on the Hubble. Well, no. I'm sorry to be the person who breaks it to you. They're very faint, and getting closer to them doesn't make them any more sharper or brighter. And the reason we know this is because we sit in the middle of the Milky Way galaxy. We sit in the middle of it. It's like a pancake that we're baked into, and it goes all the way around the night sky. And when you look at it with the naked eye, it's a gray blur. It's a pronounced gray blur in dark sky, but it's a gray blur, and any kind of light, it pretty much disappears. So that's what any of these nebulae would look like if you brought them close enough to be the size of the full moon. Obviously, the answer wants to be Saturn, because Saturn is, in fact, striking. First thing I ever saw through a telescope was Saturn, and I was done. I was hooked after. It was this big in the viewfinder, but it was in the telescope, little telescope. It was an unbelievable experience. So certainly Saturn stands up. But my first inclination is I'll just go with it just because it's an interesting question. If you could see the orbits of the moons of Jupiter, they would be bigger than the full moon right now. At the distance of Jupiter, if you look at the full moon in the sky, covers about, I want to say it's about 3 degrees. I've forgotten. Honest to God, forgotten what the full moon diameter is. I'm ashamed of that. But in any event, the angular width of the full moon at its orbit, or the moon at any point, full or not, because the moon stays the same size more or less. If you've got the moon, let me try this a little more simply. If you've got the moon in the sky, and next to it you've got the bright dot of Jupiter, you cannot resolve Jupiter. You can't, with the naked eye, you can't see the disk of it. You certainly can't see the clouds on it. However, if you could see the orbits of the Jovian moons, they would be wider than the moon is, significantly wider, because Jupiter is its own solar system. That would be kind of cool. Otherwise, I'd go with Saturn. And I'm hearing from Ash37 here that he looked at nebulae and so on with a telescope, but that's entirely my point. First of all, looking at it, look, I've looked through powerful telescopes at nebulae, and you can see a lot more detail than you can with the naked eye, but it is nevertheless a gray smudge. And it's never more than that. It may be a relatively bright, relatively well-resolved gray smudge, but it's a gray smudge. And it doesn't get better when it gets closer. The Magellanic Clouds are two galaxies that orbit the Milky Way, and they're gray smudges too. I've seen them in the southern hemisphere. Anyway, I think that's probably the answer, Zechariah. Obviously, I'll just take the easy answer and say Saturn, because it is, in fact, the most spectacular thing that scales up. Actually, in the real world, that's kind of a cool way of saying it. Saturn, of all the astronomical objects out there, is by far, and I'm speaking as a guy now who worked in an observatory for the public over 6 or 7 years. Saturn is by far the one celestial object that performs. When you look at Saturn in a telescope, it does in fact knock you on your ass. Boom! It's unbelievable. Jupiter, you can see occasionally, you see bands around there, and you have to learn, averted vision, all the rest. Mars is generally a disappointment in a telescope, and the Moon is spectacular, but it's monotonous and blindingly bright. But Saturn pays off. Saturn is the only thing I've ever seen through a telescope that was more impressive than the pictures. The only thing. And nothing else comes close to it. Interesting question, though. I love those kind of questions. All right, let's see what we got here. That was number 10 likes. With 9 likes is Susan Speaking. We're starting to run into a little cultural elite here, which is not a problem because it's being democratically determined. But here we go. So Susan Speakman is back, and she says, 1 hour, okay, then is the designation of hate crime the first step to controlling thought? It attempts to take into account the ideas, the hate in a perp's head. In many cases, yes, there is hate, racism, bigotry, etc., but who defines what it is that constitutes the hate? I say a crime is a crime is a crime. What say you? I say a crime is a crime is a crime. I say that murdering a gay person is no better or worse, no more vile or less vile than murdering anybody else. The whole definition of hate crime is designed, I don't know whether it's designed by the people that want special treatment for hate crimes like gays. I don't suspect it is. I suspect all of this is part of the gigantic progressive movement to constantly take Americans, not just Americans, human beings, and put them into tribes, because they can then do what they're doing now with Black Lives Matter. They are now, look, Black Lives Matter is pretty simple, really. Black Lives Matter is here because the Democrats cannot win without 80-90% of the black vote. I was distracted by our friend CSR Gifted Actual, who we've often known by different names. He says he'd choose an accretion disk of a black hole, which in fact might be very spectacular to look at, but you wouldn't have any time to look at it because it's immediately fatal. If it was close enough to be the size of the full moon, you'd be dead from the radiation of it before you got a chance to look at it. And in any event, Black Lives Matter, Susan, is designed to get Hillary Clinton or the Democrat elected. The Democrats need huge numbers of blacks to come out because they vote 90% Democrat or higher. And they need women too, but they need blacks. So the black Americans came out strong for Obama in 2008, and it came out strong for him again in 2012. That really upset the apple cart as far as prediction goes. Nobody thought that black America would come out in the same numbers in 12 that they did in 2008, and that's why Romney lost. Because that coalition held together for 12. Hillary is not generating anything like that kind of enthusiasm among blacks, or also against is not generating that kind of enthusiasm among the young. So Black Lives Matter is here for one reason, and that is to convince black America that they're being exterminated by white racist policemen, and that only the Democrats who feel their pain can help them. Any other questions about that? That's it. That's it in a nutshell. They're burning down cities, and they're sending protesters to places like Charlotte to gin up this argument that white policemen are assassinating blacks in large enough numbers as to make blacks think that they have to get out and vote in a Democrat in order to eliminate this plague that doesn't exist. When I say the plague doesn't exist, I'm not saying that there aren't, in fact, unfair shootings of black people by policemen, needless to say, and I'm not saying that there's not racial bias on the part of policemen. I'm not saying that either. What I'm saying is there's one number, and it'd be a nice thing to memorize. I certainly did. And this number destroys all of this racism argument on the part of white policemen. And the number is this. In 2014, there were 6,095 black homicides, and of that 6,095 black homicides, 258 of them were caused by policemen, which is about 4%. So even if you assume that the 4% of the blacks shot by police were completely unjustified, they're certainly not completely unjustified, not all of them. But assume that every single time a policeman shot a black person, it was unjustified. That'd still be 4% of the total black deaths. So if Black Lives really matter to Black Lives Matter, then why aren't we going after the 96% of the deaths? Why are we making a national cause and rioting over 4%? When we should be dealing with the 96%. Wouldn't you rather? I mean, look, if you've got a problem and 96% of the problem is over here and 4% of the problem is over here, and you not only do you concentrate on the 4%, you totally ignore the 96%, then there's your answer. And by the way, there's no way for them to escape this answer. It's one of these airtight arguments because it's an airtight argument because it's airtight. When that number comes up in 2014, 6,095 blacks killed and 258 of them by policemen, even assume that every single one of the police deaths was completely unjustified, which is utter nonsense, it's still 4% of the total black homicides in the country. And that's the end of that. That's not to say, again, that these injustices and abuses don't happen. They do. But they're not the epidemic that the progressives are making them into. So that was number 9 with Susan Speakman. We got next. Looks like we're back to Isaac Tiemann's at number 7 as I saved the screen here. What will the universe end in a big bang? Will the universe end in a big rip as phantom energy pushes the acceleration of universal expansion past the speed of light and all distances between points converge to infinity? Well, that's one possibility, Isaac, and obviously that depends on the amount of total amount of mass in the universe. The funny question, obviously, but there's a serious answer to that. The question about the future of the universe, the big future, is pretty simple, and that is there enough gravity? Certainly the universe is expanding. There's no question about that. We know it's expanding. We know the rate of its expansion. And if we run the clock backward, we come back to the Big Bang and Planck time and all the rest, an infinitely small, infinitely dense, infinitely hot point that has been expanding at a rate that we're able to compute with a very high degree of accuracy. And furthermore, we see background radiation, background radio signals as a result of that initial explosion. They're out there, they're where they're supposed to be, they're at the right frequency, they're at the right distance, all of that. So where does it go in the future? Well, if you've got this gigantic explosion that's pushing the universe apart, and the universe is composed of matter, and matter has gravitational effects on each other, every instant that it expands, the gravity of all of the universe is going to want to pull this thing back together again. So the question really is, did the Big Bang have escape velocity? I think that's not a bad way to put it. I've never heard it put that way, but it's not a bad way to put it. Did the Big Bang achieve escape velocity? Escape velocity means when you get something moving fast enough on the surface of a planet like the Earth, if it moves fast enough, it's not only going to go into orbit. Well, technically you need a circularizing boost, but if you've got something that's moving fast enough, it will escape the Earth's gravitational pull. It doesn't matter how much. Once it hits a certain velocity, the gravity of the Earth cannot stop it anymore. It's got escape velocity. It's leaving the Earth's gravitational field. It's not leaving the sun's gravitational field, but it's leaving the Earth's gravitational field permanently. It's out of here. Escape velocity. And so the question is, did the universe's initial expansion achieve escape velocity? Did the universe expand energetically enough so that even though the mutual attraction of matter wants to pull it back, slow it, stop it, and reverse it, is it moving fast enough? And really the question is there enough matter to stop it? Because if there isn't enough matter to stop it, then what you just suggested happens. The universe just essentially runs away and just gets bigger and bigger and essentially just cools to nothingness. But if there is enough mass, then it stops the acceleration, and then it returns to start shrinking, and then eventually collapses back into that point again, which would be a sight to see, I think. And I think the latest answer, according to what we know of science, I believe the latest answer is yes, there is in fact enough mass to stop this expansion. We're seeing the universe expanding at a rate that indicates that it's slowing and will in fact stop and reverse itself. That's the good news. The bad news is that even though the mass is there, we don't know where it is. We can't find it. It's not visible mass. It's not stars. It's not nebulae. It's not dust clouds that we can see. It's not even the presence of dwarf planets or brown stars and that kind of thing. There seems to be enough mass to be stopping this expansion, cause the creation of it, and a large amount of that mass is not visible to us. We don't know what it is, and we don't know where it is. It's the famous dark matter, there it goes. The CFR Gisted actual says escape velocity is still in orbit. It's not an orbit. Escape velocity, the definition of escape velocity is you've escaped orbit. In any event, that's the question and the answer, and this is an eclectic show, so there we go. Moving down the line here, we'll get to CSR Gifted. Hey, look at that. What are we doing on time here? 41 minutes. Yes. So he says that given SpaceX's frontier is lowering the cost of spaceflight, why do you think Elon and company decided to pioneer pure carbon fiber construction for its Mars architecture rather than going with a big dumb booster made of steel? I don't know the details of the engineering, but my guess would be that up until SpaceX, it seemed to everybody, certainly it seemed to me, and I never heard anybody say anything different. It may have been a theoretical thing, but if it was, it wasn't on the board in any serious way. Up until SpaceX, the idea of reusability, and reusability is what keeps the cost down. If every single time you launch something into orbit, you not only have to throw away the tanks and the structure, which are expensive, but that's not where the money is. If every single time you launch a rocket, you have to take those priceless rocket engines and chuck them into the ocean, then it's going to be an expensive proposition. Every time you go up, if you go up to refuel, if you go up to visit a space station, if you go up to launch a space station, every time you go up, you're throwing away the engines, you're throwing away the fuel tanks, throwing away all of this. So up until SpaceX landed a rocket vertically, took the booster rocket, the first stage, did its job, and then kept enough fuel to come back down and land on a dime, I had always assumed, and most people had assumed, that the only way you'd get into reusable spaceflight would be with aeronautical aircraft like the space shuttle. And the space shuttle was originally designed to be launched from the back of a carrier aircraft, and basically sit on the back of a large jet, and the jet would fly as high as it could, 50, 60,000 feet, get going as fast as it could, set the right departure angle. I think that's alpha, and you light the candle on the shuttle, and off it goes. The booster then flies back to Earth, the shuttle flies back to Earth, and all you have to do is refuel it, essentially. That's a cheap system. You could cycle that all day, basically, for the cost of the fuel. And that's how you get big changes in space. But Elon Musk and SpaceX changed the equation when they recovered the first stage booster. It's unheard of. So now, instead of, if you had 3 rockets under the old system, you'd get 3 launches. Every one of them ends up in the Atlantic. But if you have 3 boosters of the type that SpaceX has made work, then those 3 rockets could literally get you hundreds of launches. They could just be cycling. One goes up, and while the other one's coming down, and the third one's being refueling, you just go. And that seems to be the set of his plans, is that with the reusable boosters, we're able to do things that don't make any sense at all economically without a reusable booster. And one of them is you put this gigantic shuttle up into orbit, and then you refuel it in orbit. You have to take fuel up from the gravity well of the Earth. Something 96%, 97% of the energy needed to go to anywhere in the solar system is spent getting into Earth orbit. 95, 96% of the total energy to go to Pluto is just to get into Earth orbit. So you're hauling up fuel from a very strong, deep gravity well. And the only way to do that is with raw force, and the raw force means a big rocket. And fuel's not expensive. Liquid oxygen costs less than milk, I think. Many of these rockets are running on either alcohol or methane, or some are working on hydrazine, I guess. But in any event, the fuel's not the big cost. So what Elon's done is redefine the game by changing the economics of the big dumb rocket. Because in a nutshell, it's not a big dumb rocket. anymore. It's a big smart rocket, and it lifts a hell of a lot of tonnage into space, and then it comes back and it's recycled and it does it again. And that is the cost. That's the look. We could do anything anywhere if we had infinite money, right? I mean, if we had infinite amounts of money in cash on hand, if there was such a thing. Who cares if we throw away a rocket every time? We've got infinite amount of money. We've got infinite budgets. Just keep them coming. Just march them off the assembly lines. But we don't have infinite money. So this is the game changer, is the reusability of the booster. I've seen the animation of his plan to Mars. And one of the things they say in there is that it's not going to look like this. It's going to look exactly like this. This is what we're going to build. And hooray for that. I'm so glad to finally hear some audacity and some and reasonable timeframes. We're going to launch in 4 years. This first one, my God, that's. I wish they could have done this 40 years ago. However, I will say, just as an aside, that appears to be about the ugliest space vehicle I've ever seen. That interplanetary shuttle. That thing looks like it came out of a really, really bad movie in 1955. I was hoping for something cooler, and by cooler I mean something even looked like the space station. But this is one ugly. The SpaceX shuttle looks like something that I would have drawn when I was in 4th grade. But with all that said, hoorah! And I'd ride it in a heartbeat, absolutely in a heartbeat. I think it'd be a lot of fun. Okay, let's see what we're doing on time here. About another 10 minutes, I guess. Wow, we're getting all kinds of wonderful questions today. That's 3. Oh, hold on, I'm trying to get them in order here. Yeah, that's all 3. Okay, so Justin R. White says, you've spoken about the baked-in nature of time, i.e., we have free will, yet our actions are already established in time as a whole. Would the existence of a supernatural being beyond those confines explain biblical descriptions of God as simultaneously was, is, and is to come? That's the question, Justin. And look, I've always had a strong science bent, and I've always believed in science as a tool. I don't believe in it as a religion. I don't believe it as a philosophy. But I have a very high respect for science's ability to detect and explain extraordinarily difficult, subtle things about nature. We're talking about the Big Bang a minute ago. The fact that we have the minds, we can do experiments and have the mathematical minds and the imagination to run the clock back to 1/100,000th of a second after the Big Bang. Beyond that was the Planck frontier. We can't see beyond that. That's an awful lot of amazing brain work. Just getting in an airplane and flying in a commercial jet from New York to Los Angeles is an astonishing mastery of physics and metallurgy, chemistry, all the rest. So I've always had a great deal of respect for experimental results. And when I was a complete atheist, objectivist kind of a guy, Richard Dawkins kind of guy, I took that position because that's where the evidence was. Once I saw the experiment that Carl Sagan did, this was about 13 when I went through this, where basically you take the elements from a gas giant, which are in abundance in the universe, hydrogen, helium, methane, and ammonia. And I don't know if it was Sagan who did it, but it's certainly Sagan who wrote about it. You take hydrogen, helium, methane, and ammonia, you put it in a glass bottle, you run a little electric spark through it, and what comes out of the water, what comes out on the side is this brown stuff called amino acids, and they're the building blocks of life. And that to me was a perfectly reasonable mechanical explanation for how life started. And nothing on that has changed. But if you want to know what really, really changed me and made me realize just how narrow that view was, and how incredibly provincial it was, and how arrogant I was, and how sure I was of it, the thing that changed my mind is actually very simple, and it's changed a lot of people's minds in science, and that is the nature of the quantum universe. So we've been spending all this time talking about the big universe of gravity and massive objects and huge distances and large amounts of time. When you look in the other direction, you don't see the same kind of order that you see out in the outer universe. You don't see the same kind of order you see here today. Newton thought that the universe was essentially a giant clock that got wound up because all of the physical reactions could be understood. And for most of the intervening last 300-400 years, people thought it was just a question of better instruments that allow us to understand how all these forces are in motion. Everything's predictable. Everything's knowable, but predictable is the word. So it comes as a great shock. I mean, a really great shock to find endless mountains of evidence. Look, we're only having this conversation because we understand quantum effects. When we get down to the very small, we find something really shocking. And what we find is that the nature of matter is fluid. It appears, I don't have a great understanding of it, but basically, when you get down to the very small levels, the universe essentially hasn't made up its mind on the small scale, and that the universe, I'm not going to even say the universe because it sounds like the hippy-dippy universe. Nature, matter, and energy, matter essentially decides how it's going to be constructed when you look at it. Because before you look at it, it's in both states. This is the entire Schrodinger's cat argument. When there's a 50-50 chance of a cat in a box, and there's a 50-50 chance that this fuse is going to break through and release a poison that kills the cat. It is exactly 50% chance. So, according to quantum theory, the reason this analogy works is that if you don't look in the box, is the cat dead or alive? And quantum tells you it's a stupid argument, self-defeating argument. The cat is both dead and alive in the box. It exists in a state of in-between and both simultaneously, and it doesn't decide. The cat doesn't decide. The nature of quantum doesn't decide whether the cat's alive or dead until somebody opens the box and looks in. Then by looking into the box, you're forcing nature to make a decision. I know that's an extremely bizarre thing to say. It's more bizarre to see it turn out experimentally all the time, but it's exactly true. When we observe something, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle blew my mind, but that's only a small part of it. Heisenberg said that you can determine the position of an electron, or you can determine its speed or direction, but you cannot determine both. If you look at one, it locks the other one out. That seemed like, wow, that's kind of odd. But more and more and more, what we find out is on the very small level that everything is a series of probabilities. These probabilities exist in a sort of a formlessness, and you observe something, and when you observe something, it gives you back a result. It gives you a result. As a quick aside, yes, this, right, where is it? Yes, that is the, there. Hey, it's so hard to do this. That is, in fact, the Gorn captain who's fallen off the wall, and I don't have time to put him back up yet. So back to this quantum thing. Yes, it's absolutely uncanny. When you look at something, you change it. So, what does that have to do with God? Well, if we're capable with our little monkey brains, if our little cantaloupe-sized gray jelly is capable of looking at nature on a small scale, and by observing it, we essentially create it, we essentially give it form, then it's not a hard thing for me to make the leap to say, well, I don't expect that this couple of pounds of gray jelly is in fact the greatest consciousness in the universe. It probably is, but let's say it's not. Then if I can change the force, if I can change the structure of nature and matter by observing it, then who's to say that a far greater intelligence is not able to change the nature of matter by observing it as well, and change it to such a degree where it creates things? Because we can create things. We take an experiment where we shoot light through a couple of slots, and light will behave as either a particle or a wave. And as it turns out that when we don't look at it, it behaves one way, and when we look at it, even with a camera, it turns the other way. It looks different. It behaves like, I forget which is which, but let's just say it's a particle, behaves like a particle, and then we turn a camera on or we peek in the door, and then it behaves like a wave. I know that sounds impossible, but it's not. It's actually true. So if our little monkey brains can observe and create the structure of the universe on a very, very small scale, then it's not hard for me at all to imagine a consciousness great enough to simply think things into existence. And if that's not God, then I don't know what is. And we're also not just the prisoners of probability on the quantum level. We're also the prisoners of our dimensional limitations. If we imagine a flat land of people that live on a perfectly flat surface, and essentially, even though a deck of cards has some thickness, not hard for us to imagine. It's impossible to imagine a perfectly flat plane that has no depth whatsoever. We can't imagine it. We can only imagine it smaller and smaller and thinner, but we can't imagine it. But if beings lived in a two-dimensional world, we'd be able to look down on their lives in 2 dimensions and see things that they couldn't imagine. We'd be able to see inside their houses because there'd be no roofs on their houses. There'd be no roofs on their houses because there's no 3rd dimension for a roof. So a flatlander locking himself in his room would walk into essentially a square with a hole on one side, and he'd close a flap, and he'd be locked out. Nobody else could get in, but we can look directly down into him and not only see what he's doing in that little room, we can also look inside him. We can see his digestive system because he has no 3rd dimension to block our vision. There's nothing in between us and him. It's all accessible to us in the 3rd dimension. There's nothing in the 2nd dimension that we can't see, and things that are secret or enclosed in the 2nd dimension are obvious to us. It's not like we have to look down. It's not like we have to look for it. It's there. When we perceive the 2nd dimension, we see everything inside of 2nd dimensional creatures instantly because we're in the 3rd dimension. This is undoubtedly true for the 4th dimension, and that means that if there's a 4th dimensional being watching me right now, what he's able to do is take a position that's not up or down. It's not either length or width or breadth, but it's a 4th dimension perpendicular to the other 3. That's impossible. It's virtually impossible to imagine, but you can get the shadow of it. And he's able to look down into this room, and he can see. He's not above the ceiling. He's beyond the ceiling. So he not only looks into this room, which is closed, and can see me and everything that's going on. He can also look and see all of my internal organs because the 3rd dimension's not an obstacle to him. So he can see all of my internal organs simultaneously, see the inside and the outside of the room simultaneously, and all of this. And that's the 4th dimension, and there's no reason to believe that there's not 5th, 6th, 7th dimensions and so on. When you get into this kind of a universe, and these kind of probability trees and all the rest of it, then you certainly cannot lock out the idea of a God. And the more you understand about it, the more reasonable it becomes to me. When you get really hard into it, you start to see things that this cascade of probabilities, this sense that once we start looking at things, it has to make a decision from the subatomic level all the way up to cats and galaxies. Then once you understand that to be true, and it is true, it's strange but true, then you begin to realize something really, really remarkable, and that is this. I used to believe that that intelligence and consciousness was not the result of God, but it was the result of a mechanical universe. And the more we learn, we begin to realize, no, the mechanical universe is the result of the consciousness. Isn't that a bitch? It's that the universe is not made out of matter or even gravity. It's made out of information. It's made out of information, observations, and decisions. This is experimentally true. How somebody like Richard Dawkins, who's certainly smart enough to know this, can sit there and say that the whole idea of a God who created the universe is not just theoretically impossible, but nonsense. It's juvenile. It's a form of childishness to believe that. How he has access to the same information I do. I'm sure he's smarter than I am, and he's a scientist, but once you understand that by looking in a room, you change the nature of what is going on the wall in that room by looking, then everything else falls into place, right? If my little monkey brain can look at things and make changes, then somebody's bigger brain should be able to look into a room and create what it wants to do, because observation creates reality. And the more sophisticated the observation, the more sophisticated reality has to become in order to keep up, because now you're asking more and more probability waves to compress. You're asking them to make a decision. This leads to an interesting theory, which I don't particularly subscribe to, but if it turns out that humanity is the only intelligence in the universe, which seems unlikely, then the argument, I think it's called the anthropic principle. Well, it's not the anthropic principle, it's slightly different. But the argument then is that when the greatest consciousness in the universe is a bunch of cavemen sitting around a campfire, who look up and think that the stars are basically little campfires in the sky, little sparks in the sky, then that is in fact what they are. That's not just what they appear to be, that's what they are. Stars are just little specks, little sparks in the sky that we perceive, and as we become smarter and bring out telescopes, then just the act of looking through a telescope forces the universe to become more complex. This is so counterintuitive to us. It's so counterintuitive to us. And as I've said many times before, and because we've just exceeded our fourth dimensional boundary on this conversation, the frame that you're looking at now has, the frame that you're looking at now has, it just got so hard to result. That's got height, and it's got width. What you cannot perceive is that it has depth, and there's another quality to it that you cannot perceive, and that is that it has length. It has duration is the term I'm looking for. So the Stratosphere Lounge today, you're seeing in 2 dimensions. You're seeing a 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional world, and you're also getting the 4th dimension, which is duration. An object exists in space, and it exists there for a certain amount of time. I said this before. I love this idea so much. When you take a picture of something, you take a photograph of something, you're taking a 3-dimensional object, reducing it to 2 dimensions, but you're carrying it through the 4th dimension. If I have a photograph of something that happened to me when I was a kid, that photograph preserves an image of that moment through the 4th dimension. A photograph is moving, is an object moving through the 4th dimension. That's really cool. Anyway, this concludes our evening of right-wing conservative political commentary. Hopefully the rest of you knuckle-dragging savages and racists and homophobes and ignorant Bible Belt Jesus lovers and nose-breathing, low-sloping forehead, savages who live out in flyover country. Hopefully this has been your dose of, weekly dose of, religion, guns, and America, because we're much smarter than they are. Not only we're smarter for a reason, we're smarter because we're smart enough to realize our limitations, and that is the beginning of learning. So I'm sorry to have to make this an hour, but I have to get this thing shot tonight, and I have to get it edited, and I have to do the post on it, which will actually be pretty simple because it's going to be Hillary Clinton asking a question and a freeze frame of her looking over at me, and I'm just going to destroy her. And if it runs 15 minutes, it runs 15 minutes. I don't care. It's just so much material there. It just has to be dealt with. So that's that. And until next week, this is the Stratosphere Lounge. I want to say 131, maybe 130. Yeah, 131. God only knows. I think it's 131. Some people know. Yes. By the way, Matt J. Harris makes a point, and I think we should make this point constantly. I just want to thank all of you deplorable people for watching what is. I think you can make a pretty compelling case that this is the most deplorable show on the internet, and for me to gather a group of deplorables like yourself is an incredible privilege. I hate to keep coming back to this, but it's a privilege made possible by the paying members at BillWhittle.com. If you're one of them, a special thanks to you. If you're not, please become one, because we feel like we're doing good work out there, and the work is not going to end because the election occurs. And by the way, hearty congratulations to our friend Viper Check out there, who has just become promoted from one grade to another in one of the armed services of the United States of America, and God knows he deserves it. This military may be emasculated by progressive policies and may be underfunded and all the rest of it. However, the people in there, and I can testify to this because I've met a bunch of them, the people in there are made out of solid gold. And as long as we have people like Viper Check in our military, I not only don't fear for the safety of the country from external invasion, I don't fear for the safety of the country from internal suppression either. So congratulations there, buddy. Couldn't happen to a better guy, and I hope everybody saluted the living daylights out of you, because you certainly deserve it. All right, so that's it for the Stratosphere Lounge. I gave you an extra 9 minutes and 20, 30 seconds by the time we close. It's my pleasure to do so. Sorry I have to run so short tonight. Got a lot of work to do. We're in, it's Black Friday between now and November 8th, and then after that we get a little break. So again, thanks for joining us. Thanks especially to the paying members. And I will see you hopefully next Wednesday. Expect Flea next Wednesday. And if it's not next Wednesday, it's because I'm doing some more work trying to save this wonderful country that we all love and that you support and keep happening. So until then, everybody, you be careful out there. Don't let the bastards get you down, because that's what they are intending to do, and they're very, very good at it. Just remember, you're not alone out there, and you're right. All right, we'll see you later. Bye.